This is Abigail Favale, and you're listening to George Fox Talks Culture. All right, well, I'm joined in the studio today with Peter Boghossian, a founding faculty at the University of Austin, formerly at Portland State University, just up the road. He's a philosopher and also the author of a book called How to Have Impossible Conversations.
Correct.
And he's kind of a general rabble-rouser, you might say, in the academy. So
Correct.
I'm very excited to have what will probably just be a very interesting and wide-roving conversation. So welcome, Peter. Thanks for joining us.
I appreciate it. George Fox at Christian University, which is very interesting. My first book was a manual for creating atheists.
Yeah.
So it kind of speaks to the culture war a little bit, where we are now.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's totally true. Well, welcome.
Thank you.
I was married to an atheist for 10 years. He's not necessarily an atheist anymore, but I still love him just the same.
Are you still married to him?
I am.
Really?
Yeah.
So your marriage survived. You said you had a conversion experience.
Yeah. I became Catholic.
Oh, really? You're Catholic now?
Yeah. Yeah. About 8 years ago.
And how is he with that?
Oh, he's amazing. He rolled with it.
Really?
Yeah. So anyway, but
So it wasn't an issue for him.
no, I mean, it became something that we had to navigate in our relationship for sure, because then, and then we had kids. And so then it was like, okay, well, what do we do with this? That's the thing, right?
Yeah. So
but
what
anyway,
did you do with them?
so, well, they're being raised Catholic, and, my husband, Michael's, he's figuring out his own kind of spirituality. And anyway, so, but he was very supportive, bewildered at times. So,
Interesting.
yeah. Anyway, so we were just talking before we started recording,
Right.
about the culture wars,
Correct.
right? So I'm interested in how you position yourself in relation to the culture wars. Do you think of yourself as a warrior, like you are fighting the culture war? And if so, on what side, or how would you even, like, what are you fighting? What battle are you fighting? What are you hoping to achieve?
Pro basic freedoms, pro cognitive liberty. So if you're, we did a prayer before it answered. You want to pray? Anybody can pray all they want. I don't have to choose to participate in that if I don't want to. So that we each have our own degree of liberty. I love this country. I love the freedoms this country was founded on. I believe in democracy. I believe in the rule of law. So I believe in Miranda rights, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, and these things are being attacked now. I also very firmly believe in science and scientific skepticism, and these things are being supplanted by lived experience and standpoint epistemology and other forms of silliness. And so I just view myself as someone who's honest about facts and evidence. And that runs me afoul of the dominant moral orthodoxy, particularly as the left, academic institutions on the left are being increasingly ideologically captured.
How would you characterize the ideology that has captured academia?
One word, I guess, would be woke. It's kind of become a pejorative now. Social justice or critical social justice with an uppercase S and J, an obsession with immutable characteristics, particularly in regard to race, gender, and sexual orientation, and an inability to. I think the move has been one from epistemology to morality, and the Theaetetus, Socrates talks about how. Plato wrote, Socrates talked, assuming that was true, there was historical Socrates. But if someone has a belief about something, to have knowledge, you need justified true belief, JTB. And so if somebody had a different opinion, it was because their starting conditions were different. So they didn't have a piece of knowledge. But the academy now is consumed by this idea of that if people have a different opinion, they must be a bad person. There's something morally deficient in those people.
So is there, like, let's start with standpoint epistemology. You mentioned that. So how would you define standpoint epistemology?
It's funny. I was just reading about this yet again the other day. I just interrupt myself and I'll answer your question. I think if you read about this stuff too much, even if you don't go into it and not believe it, I think it damages people. I mean, I find myself damaged by this. I give you specific examples, like, you walk in a store, if you've been reading this stuff long enough and you see a couple and one of them a different race, you start quote unquote interrogating the power relations. And I think that does everybody a profound injustice. I do believe, as King believed, in color blindness. I don't believe the Kendi vision. We just put out a video about that today, explaining Ibram Kendi's anti-racist baby, which is a true form of ideological madness. But standpoint epistemology is the basic idea that we each have a standpoint or point of view from which we view something, and it forwards the primacy of our lived experiences. So my lived experiences, particularly as someone, if I were oppressed, my lived experiences give me access to the truth. So you can think about it as if I am actually a white heterosexual cisgendered male. So I see the world in grayscale. So I assume you're, I don't know, I don't want to make any judgments, but
no, don't do. What am I?
White heterosexual, I don't know. I had a thought that I won't be. But so you have these things, but so you see, because you're a woman and you're cis, you see the world in an extra color. Now, if you're in a wheelchair, you see that. So every oppression variable you have, it gives you more access to the truth. So standpoint epistemology is kind of turning away from something that's been a long-standing tradition in the modernist historical concept of objectivist epistemology, or looking at objective ways of knowing. Sometimes it's the term people use, the negative, the pejorative, is a scientism, but it's toward the subjective experiences of people. So let me give you an example of why it's a problem. So let's say African Americans say we're pulled over disproportionately by the police. I'm not going to get into the data on that. It's irrelevant to standpoint epistemology. The idea that we would believe the experiences of people who have been oppressed, as opposed to actually what does the data say? So my response to that would be, well, what does the data say? And we can look at body cams, when police pull over, for whatever reason, they look at the license, they call the license. I mean, there are ways to objectively adjudicate the fact of, are African Americans pulled over more disproportionately? So, but standpoint epistemology is the turn toward lived experience.
So why is that harmful, though? Like why does it harm you?
Well, because how do you adjudicate anything? And plus, why should we? It's like the believe all women thing. Like, really? Believe all women? Like, anybody who's, I'm 55, Tawana Brawley was a famous case of somebody in New York City who alleged to have been raped and have all these terrible things I'm not even going to say on air happen to her. It's just not true. So I also make a prediction because of the postmodern turn. I predict evangelicals are going to turn away from personal testimony as evidence for the historicity of Jesus.
Well, why though? Because wouldn't personal testimony be, isn't that kind of what you're saying? This lived experience, this subjective experience as evidence? Isn't that? So why would evangelicals turn away from that if that's kind of a hallmark of the new regime?
Because, first of all, the contextual background of that, there's a schism in evangelical Christianity now, as I'm sure you know, Southern Baptists, et cetera, about the role of intersectionality and critical race theory, for example, in do we need additional research resources to interpret texts, specifically the Bible, but text in general. And so once you start saying that we can look at the lived experiences of people, and we know that lived experience will get you only so far. Lived experience is excellent in terms of subjectivity, matters of taste. Like, I woke up this morning and I'm trying not to eat sugars, and I saw these cookies and I thought, oh my God, those would be so good. Those would be insanely good. I'm almost infallible in terms of my own subjectivity. But when it comes to objectivity, the example, a percentage of African Americans pulled over by police is a percentage of the total, what have you. You can't rely on that. And so the idea that you can look to testimony of Christians and use that, of who've experienced Jesus, and then use that as evidence for an historical Jesus and of the Bible, et cetera, I believe that will fall into ill repute among in apologetic circles, precisely because they've seen people on the other side of the political and ideological divide use standpoint epistemology and lived experiences to things that simply didn't add up. And so at some point they'll say, okay, the people have used this, and we know it has been used to justify a conclusion that is false, and we don't want to be placed in the same position. That's my supposition. So
it sounds like maybe you're talking about a hermeneutics of suspicion, right? So evangelicals will kind of adopt this way of reading the Bible that's suspicious of power dynamics at play.
Correct.
And then that will basically erode the authoritative, the authority of the Bible. And so is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, to an extent, but it won't be the go-to to convince people that they should believe in Jesus.
What will be the goal?
That I don't know.
That's
that
interesting.
I can't say.
That's interesting. Okay. Is there anything true or good to be mined from standpoint epistemology, from your opinion?
Yeah, there is. That's the other thing about what in cynical theories Pluckrose calls applied epistemology. Applied postmodernism, is that there is a kernel of truth in almost all, if not all, of this stuff. And so, yes, people were oppressed. Yes, people still are treated differently on the basis of their race. Yes, there's still, is it systemic? That's another question. But there's certainly the legacy of systemic racism is absolutely undeniable. So there is a kernel of truth in all of this, which is why it's been latched onto. This is my opinion. That's one of the factors that caused it to be latched onto. So I think it would be, to revisit the example, it would be reason to look at, to do a study, a quantitative study about police pulling people over, or maybe a mixed method studies as well. It would be a reason to inquire into events. It would also be something, I think, I was reading an article the other day about, in Denmark, they have in libraries, I think it's in 80 libraries from what I've read, they have, you can go to the library and you can talk to people who have a different set of experiences and they tell you about their life. I think there's something very useful in understanding. I just came back from Hungary and I would speak to Ukrainians and my goodness. I think there's something extraordinarily useful in developing a sense of compassion or listening to people and trying to understand where they're coming from. And the fact that only in the rarest of rare instances is someone actually your enemy. For the most part, everybody's just trying to get through their day, doing their own thing, living their own life. They're trying to pay their bills. They got health concerns. They got problems. They got worries. And then even in those rare concerns, it's from someone who suffers some kind of psychopathy. Well, it's about 1%, 1.2% of the population on the hair scale. But I think that there is something to be learned not only from standpoint epistemology, but from the original postmodernists, Foucault, Lyotard, Derrida, et cetera, and the applied postmodernists.
Yeah, no, I would agree. And I think one tricky thing that the culture wars seem to do is to, aggressively pit tribes against each other where there's nothing, so it's either like, all we should read is CRT, or we have to totally cancel CRT from schools or whatever. So
and that's the thing. It's the weapons now are canceling and defunding.
Yeah,
and I understand the impulse. I think it's a terrible idea.
So do you see the cancel culture phenomenon being used by both sides in the culture war?
I do far more on the left than the right, but I do. And I also think there's a tendency that people, they become consumed in cancel culture without understanding that there's an underlying rot that's pushing. Cancel culture is just a small manifestation of a much larger problem.
So what is that much larger problem?
Critical social justice, the idea that there are values that are not worth fighting for, that we've kind of worked out already. Enlightenment values, the idea that you can live by your own lights, that certain fundamental freedoms that I mentioned before, the othering of people, or the idea that, which is really it almost breaks my heart to think about it, but the idea that people have access to truth based upon their immutable characteristics. I mean, it's a completely insane idea, but it's also shoving the entire civilization down a toilet.
But there is a way in which one's immutable characteristics shape one's experience in the world, right?
Sure.
Because whether or not, it's true, we have these, American Enlightenment, liberal values, but there also is a history of, like you said, systemic racism. Sure. And so it seems like there are ways in which we internalize these sorts of narratives that become ways in which they shape our experience. And some of that internalization might be untrue or less true. That's something I've thought about in my own kind of intellectual journey as a feminist. So I remember, and looking back now, I can see how when in college, when I became really interested in feminism, on the one hand, it gave me a way to, I grew up in very conservative evangelicalism. And so it gave me a place to begin to name some of the problems I saw in that culture in relation to women. But then after a few years, I think I began to almost internalize this idea of myself as a victim or always disempowered in any interaction with men. Like there's this idea like gender priming, right? Where you're if I'm having, I remember once I was having a conversation with 3 male colleagues who all happened to be just super tall. And I think I was pregnant at the time and I'm kind of short anyway. So I just felt like this bowling ball next to these like giant man trees. And in that moment, I just felt so aware of my sex. And my awareness was, it made me just feel kind of smaller and weaker or whatever, even though that's not true. And they weren't doing anything to create that. They were just being themselves, right? Like they had done nothing. But yeah, I think just because there is, I grew up with this narrative about women not being as, capable as leaders or whatever as men. There are moments I can point to where an awareness of my sex carries that kind of content to it in a way that does shape my experience. Now, I think it's also been helpful for me to be able to develop a kind of critical distance from that and to say like, oh, wow, I'm feeling right now like I'm this small, puny female, but actually I don't need to be feeling that way. Almost like this cognitive behavioral therapy kind of reframing. Right. Like, oh, these are just my male colleagues and they, respect me and I don't need to feel small in this environment, right? So I think there's something to standpoint. Yeah. There is something.
So that's interesting. So the last few minutes, it's really been interesting. I hear you, and I'm thinking about the conclusions that one comes to, like the conclusion in that moment with the guys, I feel small, the conclusion of because there's been historical oppression, there's equity. Okay, so we need equity to fix that. So there are these lacunas, there are these like these gaps that need to be filled in argumentation, and I do think you're right. In the individual level, it's a kind of a CBT. Maybe even on a macro level, it's just kind of a macro intervention. But there's just this assumption that from this set of historical experiences comes equity. But you have to argue for that. You just can't accept that by fiat. You can't just throw that out there and say, well, there has to be equity. If this person disagrees, they're somehow a bad person. Like you have to. And the problem is that bridge that you draw from the historical experiences of people to what we as a society do about that, that's the critical piece that's missing in this. That's the Enlightenment component. That's the reason, the rationality, the evidence component. You can't just make certain assumptions that of the way that we need to act and live as a society. I mean, you have to give reasons for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So here's a, like, let's take this idea of like gender self-identification.
Okay. Fascinating. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's basically the idea that, you can, by almost a linguistic declaration, you can become a particular gender, right? I can say I'm a man and I'm a man. Like, that's enough to.
Right.
So I don't know. I'm thinking through. This isn't necessarily my view, but I'm just kind of going to talk it through.
That's good.
Couldn't you make the argument that that phenomenon or other things like it is almost this outgrowth of the autonomous liberal modern subject who is like, I am this self-determining will, and that's kind of the anthropology, I guess, of the Enlightenment. So couldn't you almost say that that's like the Enlightenment on steroids, or like the liberal subject on steroids, the person who kind of just says.
Two things to that. One, you can, but that doesn't mean that everybody else defers to it. And two, in the literature, that's Rebecca Tuvel had that controversial piece in the journal Hypatia a few years ago that caused a whole crazy turmoil. And she asked about Rachel Dolezal, I believe her name is, and why, if somebody who's white can't self-identify as black, I mean, we accept that more or less with gender. The reason for that is because it's theorized differently in the literature. But Jordan Peterson's talked about this extensively at this point. It's there are multiple issues. There's the issue of self-identification, and which I don't think literally anybody has a problem. I mean, I've certainly never heard anybody. I don't think you could self-identify as a cow if you want, or a rhinoceros. But the issue is that how other people treat you. It's like, does that mean you get to graze in a pasture? There's actually a video of a guy who decided to live as a goat. And he built himself goat prostheses, and he found some farmers. I don't think anybody has a problem. If a guy wants to live as a goat, I really don't think literally anybody cares. It's odd, but I don't think anybody has a problem with it. But the idea is, should we allow people who self-identify as one thing to swim in a competition, or Fallon, like Leah Thomas, or Fallon Fox, the MMA? If you've ever seen a competition in which someone's been born a man and they compete in a woman's MMA event, my martial arts instructor, I do jiu-jitsu at Straight Blast, his name is Matt Thornton. He says it's not a fight, it's a beating. It's just a beating. Yeah. Or women's prisons, or rape shelters, or the idea is how the society treats them, not how they self-identify. And so I don't think it's the outgrowth of the liberal. It may be the outgrowth of the liberal subject, but it's certainly not the conclusion of the liberal social order. Mm-hmm.
Yes, because I think something I'm trying to think through in my own work, which I write stuff on gender. That's kind of my jam, and it's a very complex jam with lots of different fruits these days. But one thing I'm trying to think through is, especially since Judith Butler and the kind of postmodern turn, like you described, how we think about gender is really informed by a discourse that's fundamentally anti-realist, right? That everything we say about gender is created and constructed by society and by language. So any truth claims we make are ultimately power moves, right? They're kind of linguistic power moves or whatever. But then that kind of anti-realist gender discourse takes this different form in kind of the common discourse of the left in America, where it does take, because I think that like Butler anti-realism, that's in contrast with liberalism. But then it kind of takes this new form in becoming part of this liberal emphasis on equality and equity. And liberalism isn't necessarily an anti-realist discourse. So how those things combine on the ground, like say in the the Human Rights Council, that sort of thing. So that's something I'm thinking through. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
So that's a huge thing. So Kathleen Stock has some great stuff on that, formerly University of Sussex, also a founding faculty at the University of Austin. I do think, it's really interesting. I read the work of someone I disagree with, but I think that the thinking is Miranda Fricka, she talks about epistemic injustice and epistemic violence and application. She talks a lot about race, also gender, but I think, so I have so many thoughts are populating my head. If your goal is to publish them, you're much less likely to get something published if it goes against the moral orthodoxy. So it has to be kind of morally fashionable. I think I've demonstrated that in another capacity. I think that's pretty much well established. So I guess what did you, and then there's the publication aspect and then the actual aspect itself. When you said goes against the liberal order, what did you mean by that?
Well, I guess I see a tension in Butler and anti-realism and then
and gender troubles.
Yes. Yeah. And then just the liberal ethos of freedom and equality and autonomy. Because basically what I'm seeing is, Butler's project was let's interrogate and get rid of all these categories. But what we've seen instead is just a proliferation of new categories that are as policed as ever. And that is almost like a contradiction or tension that's interesting to me.
That the categories are artificial and imposed, and I do think that's interesting, and I don't know. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. And I know that the culture war is split on that. I know Joe Rogan tweeted out a picture a while ago of some guy in the 1830s. He was super masculine, and they had some guy in 2050. He had pink hair and he had a dog collar on, a leash on, and a little mini skirt or something. And it said, male 1830 and male 2050. And so many people jumped on this, but I'm not sure that's a bad thing. I think people should be able to self-express any way they want to self-express. I think people should be able to live any kind of life that they want to lead, including being a Christian, being a Muslim, being I actually really do believe that. And that just doesn't extend into the realm of beliefs and religion and theology, which are, of course, protected, but to people's own personal sexual proclivities. Because, so parenthetically, I don't, so just even if it weren't a choice, even the argument is, well, people don't choose that. Glenn Beck and I just talked about that. Well, people don't choose that. Okay, well, it doesn't matter to me. That's always been a red herring. But I do think that the idea of a proliferation of categories is interesting. What I find more interesting is the attempt to tell people that they ought to accept the categories. And that's where Peterson drew the line. That's also where I draw the line too.
Okay, so it's not so much people can claim whatever kind of identity or expression they want. Like this radical kind of freedom, but then imposing those beliefs on someone else or expecting a certain kind of behavior or affirmation, I guess that's where you see it as crossing the line.
Well, yeah, and also I think it's manifest, and you see this now, it's just inflamed in the culture wars. Inflamed in you see this in European schools, K-12 systems. What role should gender ideology play in the schools? My answer is literally zero. But if you want to push any value, and it should be a simple indifference, like your sexuality, your notion, whatever, that's your business. It's not my business. It's just what I do in the bedroom is none of your business, none of those guys' business. It's just none of Donald Trump or whoever's Biden, anybody, come on. But the idea is that we have we're in a really odd space right now where people are preoccupied, and they're kind of insisting that you be preoccupied with other people's sexual orientation and pronouns and race and self-identification, and they wear their pronouns and their labels, and it's in the email. I just don't think that that's, not only is that not moving forward, but that's just doing nothing but creating division among people. I don't see what, I'm going to argue against myself. So I was driving through Starbucks, and my daughter knows that I think this whole pronoun thing is insane. And there was a person at the, who was handing us the drinks, and I had no idea what gender they were, if they even had any gender. And my daughter said to me, that person should have their pronouns on their badge. I said, you know what, you're probably right. You don't need your pronouns on your badge. I was just in Seattle the other day, and people think there's an advertisement for Starbucks, but
you were at a Starbucks.
I was at a Starbucks, and there's a lot of homeless folks who come into the Starbucks, and I walked over to the security guard and said, I need to use the restroom. He just walked over to the men's room. I don't need to wear my pronoun. I don't need, Peter, he, him. But if anything, maybe there are some people, and in those circumstances, I think I personally honor those because I just don't want to be a dick. I don't know if I can swear on the show. And I just think why would you want to create more grief if it costs me nothing, if that makes someone happy? There are, I'm not going to, I don't think I'd call someone it. Maybe I would, I don't know. But
yeah.
But the issue is whether or not that should be enforced legally. That's the issue.
So in your sort of Peter Boghossian utopia, how does a society cohere? Like, what holds this like pluralist, free kind of society together?
Oh God, that question just is wonderful. Oh, I just want to let that percolate and infuse my being. It's such a great question. Reason, science, epistemic adequacy, love of truth, love of wisdom, love of freedom.
Yeah, it's pretty good things. So is truth, when you say truth, what do you mean? Is that kind of like just scientific truth, or? Things
that correspond to reality, kind of a correspondence theory of truth.
All right. Well, that seems like a pretty big criteria, right? Correspondence to reality.
Should be pretty narrow in a sense.
Well, no, it seems like a big, like that seems maybe... Sorry, I'm back on my anti-realist little thought train again because
you do. That's good. It's always good. I just want to say, I think it's really important to think out loud for people.
Yeah.
Like right now, like I don't know what I'm gonna say.
Yeah.
I think it's really important that people see that process modeled when you're thinking out loud. And I would hope you think I'm an honest interlocutor, and you could say something to me, and in the Gorgias, Plato says, or Socrates says, it's far better to be refuted than it is to refute. So I think that there's something about getting your thoughts out there and having a corrective mechanism and having this conversation modeled for other people.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. I totally agree with that. And I appreciate your willingness to get into a messy conversation like that.
Yeah.
I guess maybe, okay, so you're also a philosopher, you're also a professor. So how would you respond then, like with this idea that truth is correspondence with reality?
Yeah.
How would you respond to the, what's my truth, your truth? Like, what is reality? Like my sense of reality.
That's standpoint epistemology.
Right.
Yeah.
So then, but how would you respond, I guess, to an interlocutor who's coming from that perspective? Like, okay, yeah, well, my truth about, my identity politics truth does correspond to my reality. That's what I'm doing.
So the first thing is, it says, does that work in a bank? Does that work in a bank when you go in with a $10 bill and you tell them in your reality it's 8 $100 bills? No, so there are limits, right? So then the question is, well, what's the limit? What is the limit of that? Because clearly there has to be some limit. In fact, we just found one. So I think you need some targeted questions to help people clarify that. Because right now, again, it's just the fashion of the age. So people are saying this stuff, and I'm not really sure that they've thought it through.
But then maybe.
Like, give me an example of something that's true for you.
That's true for me.
And I'm going to try to say something as quickly as possible after you say it, so you'll know I wouldn't have thought about it.
Okay, this is hard for me actually because I don't think about truth just in relation to myself, so I'm trying to get in that headspace.
Or just think about just something that's true. Say it.
Okay, I'm a Catholic.
Objective. It's going to fall into one or two categories, subjective or objective.
I see.
And so standpoint epistemology, or your feelings are great in terms of your husband. Yeah. I can promise you I would not be attracted to your husband, romantically.
I don't know.
I can guarantee it. But the point is, subjectivity, you can't be wrong. Objectivity, you have to have some correspondence to reality. I mean, you have to. I mean, nobody... I was playing chess with a guy at the Starbucks. I'm not going to say that word again. In Seattle, when I was up in Seattle, and he pulled a chessboard, and there are certain rules that we agree on. Like I don't take a hammer and start smashing the board. I don't throw a football at him. I mean, there are certain kinds of norms that we agree upon, and as a society, we have to have some certain norms that we agree upon.
So does that mean then that your value of truth corresponding to reality, that has to be accepted by other people in this pluralist society in order for it to work?
Not at all. But there is the famous tolerance of intolerance, the whole...
But don't some values have to be imposed, right? I mean, you're kind of saying no, don't impose anything on anyone. But
absolutely. That's why we have a police force. And that's why the idea of defunding the police force is probably one of the stupidest ideas I've ever heard in my life. Truly idiotic. So the idea is that this is the key point, and this is where I think a lot of critical social justice ideology is not just bankrupt, but genuinely dangerous. So I believe two things. I believe that the moral arc bends towards justice, a la Steven Pinker and Michael Shermer. I could certainly be wrong about that, but history is replete with those. Those could be, maybe it won't continue. I don't know. So I would hold that with a very high degree of confidence. But here's what I would hold with an extraordinarily high degree of confidence, that moral values can be rationally derived.
Okay.
And I think I think that many people this is one of the reasons why many people on the progressive left won't have conversations with you. They won't have conversations with you because they think that the conversations are a way to support existing power structures. In the literature, it's termed privilege-preserving epistemic pushback. The idea that privilege seeks to preserve itself. And so any kind of exchange. I did a letter wiki exchange with Laurie Penny from England, and she wrote a letter, and then I wrote a follow-up letter. And most of the time, the vast majority of people in this space will not have a conversation with you, literally at all, about anything. Part of the reason is Judith Butler calls it non-consensual co-platforming. They won't even want a piece of theirs, their article or their letter next to yours, because it's platforming. And platforming is itself a manifestation of a power dynamic of privilege which seeks to preserve itself. So there is a built-in infrastructure to the ideology which prevents any kind of criticism whatsoever from manifesting. When you teach that to students, we have now taught an entire generation of students that. And the consequence is that they have not just become epistemologically brittle, they have become emotionally brittle. And they simply do not know how to engage in any substantive way ideas or arguments that run contrary to the beliefs that they walked into the classroom with in the first place. Mm-hmm. We have basically created a generation of people who are epistemologically crippled.
So what do we do if that's true?
Yeah. So we that's a great question. The first thing should be the simplest, easiest ask of anybody in the world: stop giving money to your alma mater, because the schools you went to 5 years ago even are not the schools of today. They're pushing a very specific woke orthodoxy. The second thing we do is we don't. My own belief of what we do is we don't burn places to the ground or what have you, institutions, but we build new institutions. We build better institutions, and we put truth front and center. So, for example, I used to teach at Portland State University. The president of Portland State University has said that the highest priority of the institution is racial justice. Okay, that's just, I'm not going to swear, but there'd be a word there, that adjective, insane, that would modify that word. That's truly the stupidest, most insane ideological statement that one could possibly make. Not research, not scholarship, not student excellence, not fiscal solvency, but racial justice. Okay, so that is so conspicuously ideological. So that's a public funded institution. right? Portland State University, publicly funded institution. So what do? We build better, like Joe Biden's model. We build new institutions. Ralston College, where Jordan Peterson is the chancellor, is a new institution in Savannah, Georgia. That's online. They're offering a graduate program now. Stephen Blackwood heads that. We build the University of Austin. New schools, new institutions are coming on. The next thing I think that we can do is you have to place truth front and center, right? And so there are certain attitudinal dispositions that go along with valuing truth. Like you have to be willing to revise your belief. You have to be willing to say, I don't know if you don't know. And currently we have created an entire academic culture where people are walking around pretending things. They're pretending that men should swim in women content, and they're pretending to believe this. Now, I'm not saying that many don't believe it. I'm hesitant to say the figure, but one of my writing partners told me from a study that I don't have, that's why I'm hesitant to say the figure, that 8% of the people consider themselves, true believers on the progressive left, and 8% on the. So you're talking about a small fraction. But the bracketing that for a second, we've created a culture in which people are either too afraid for a multiplicity of reasons, or too, I don't know what the other word would be, to say I don't know. So we have to bring back saying I don't know as a virtue. Like we have to be more humble about the things that we know. And then we're also creating cultures of pretending. People are just pretending things. They're pretending and they're in fear. They're in fear of going against the orthodoxy. So
is it fear that you think is driving if people are pretending or going along with something that they don't maybe 100% believe? Like
fear is a big, huge part of it.
Fear of what?
Well, I'm doing this reverse Q&A and I go and I ask people, well, why don't you, the things you can't say? And I don't think I had a single person, maybe they're self-selected, they come to me, or they come when they're asked about free speech. I don't think there was a single person that has come up and said, yeah, I can say what I want. And then, of course, you have the people on the left that say, well, that's only because you want to say the N-word. Like they're just a completely deranged obsession with race, sex, and gender. I mean, totally deranged. Could it possibly be that they want to ask questions because they want to know the answers, which is why they're in college in the first place? Is that they honestly don't know and they're seeking in their lives for things? Like, that's not possible? Really? It's because they have to say the N-word? Like, you really believe that? So anybody who really believes that, it's, Dawkins is right. It's the selfish gene. It's like a mimetic virus that's taken over people. I mean, this is a sickness that's manifest throughout the society. And we have people walking around who actually believe that. So it's not even a denigration of truth or a turning away from truth. It's not even head nodding to truth. Truth has no part in the worldview, which is why they don't want to platform you, which is why they don't believe that language, speech, debate, conversation, etc., is a way to solve shared problems. They only believe that that's a way for the powerful to stay in power. And then once you do that, you lose your control mechanism. You start ripping down statues. You start looking at literally not wanting to solve the homeless problem because you want the homeless problem to be seen as a manifestation of the deeper sickness, which is capitalism. And the consequence of that is people live immiserated, drug addicted. I mean, it's a very dangerous ideology.
That's like a very cynical take.
No, all you need to do is ask people.
Yeah.
That's the other thing. So say nobody who believes the stuff is hiding it. That's the other thing that's so crazy about this.
No, but really, okay, maybe I misunderstood you, but you're saying that some people want homelessness to persist in order to take down capitalism?
In order to show that this is one of the manifestations of a system that's inherently patriarchal and sick and sexist and racist and has to be destroyed. That's the other reason why they attack the police. Of course, you have some people who are just homicidal maniacs who have a grudge against police who are attacking police. Yeah, sure, I'll give that to you. 100%, nobody's denying that. But the reason for the animus against police in general is that they believe that the police are what's standing between the ruling class. They believe that the police are a way to preserve the existing power structures, the racial, gender, et cetera, power structures. And if you could take the police, we could have, I don't know some kind of utopia. But the only reason that you could say this in the first place is you just simply have to ask people. I mean, the analog would be Christianity, right? So when I was in the atheist, we were very active in the atheist movement. I would say things like, believers think this. People say, no, they don't. I mean, no, they do. And so I would literally go around and I'd find people, do you believe at one point there was ever a talking snake? And I'd have the unequivocal testimonies of people who, yeah, there's a talking snake. And I would take that recording and I would literally show it to someone who said they don't believe that. And then they would, you know what they would say? They don't believe that. I mean, okay, so what more does someone have to do to let you know that they actually believe there was a talking snake? I think it is an Achilles heel of the liberal mind that they simply cannot fathom that. They cannot fathom that people actually want to defund the police. It's just such a stupid idea. And yet there's an article the next day in the New York Times, yes, we actually do yes, we actually do mean, I can't remember if it was abolish or defund, I think it was abolish the police. And then you still have people like, well, no, they don't mean that. Well, really? Just put an op-ed in the New York Times saying they want to abolish the police. So what more evidence do you, what could they give you? Because again, it's so outside the norm of what is considered rational and reasonable that people just can't fathom that people actually believe it. But people actually believe it.
But I wonder, though, whether those are like really representative voices or if those are just the extremes, right? I mean, it seems like that would be pretty easy as an atheist to try to find like what's the easiest version of Christianity to kind of like, do some intellectual jujitsu on, like, oh, I'm going to go find,
Well, it's the same thing. So the Overton window has shifted, right? And so it went from, just if I told you a few years ago, this health equity thing, that's another level of crazy we haven't talked about at all. So the idea that we should triage medically on the basis of race, if I told you that 3 years ago, you would think this guy Boghossian, he's some kind of lunatic. Like literally no one, Dennis Prager goes on Bill Maher and that famous clip about self-identification as a man. The Overton window has shifted so much that even if you don't have the same percent, even if the same percentage is 8%, which is true believers, it's become institutionalized in the American Medical Association. All of NPR is a propaganda machine, all of CNN, most of MSNBC, ACLU, Southern Poverty Law Center. The mission statement, and this is crucial to understand, the mission statement of those institutions are different, but the people discharging the mission statements are younger and they're woke. So they have a different interpretation. So the ACLU, for example, would never have allowed the American Nazis to march in Skokie, Illinois, or anywhere for that matter, because they have a different interpretation of the mission. So while the percentage of true believers has remained the same, either people are cowed into fear of saying something or they themselves participate in this ideology. It's truly astonishing to me how many people will just throw the word equity in there like it's a good thing. It's just flabbergasting to me. It's as if the whole society, so I'll do these talks and I'll say to people, okay, who has ever heard the word equity outside of a financial context 5 years ago? They do hundreds of people, not one person will raise their hand. Not one person, hold it. I was like, okay, this is the dominant moral value now. I'm getting emails, my kids are in Portland Public School. My kid, one graduate, but constant emails, equity. Portland State University is obsessed with equity, obsessed. So wait a minute, you mean to tell me this is the dominant moral? It's literally in corporations, trainings, everywhere, and nobody can question it? And if you question it, oh, geez, why should we have equity? What's the difference between equity and equality? Can you think of an example when equity may not be a good thing? Is it falsifiable? Is there demonstrable evidence for equity? It is so astonishing that this ideology, it was like a blitzkrieg without a war. It's completely taken over the society, and anybody who questions it is the worst kind of blasphemer and heretic. And that's the situation in which we find ourselves. It is a complete cultural derangement. You want to know how the Maoists look? You want to know, wow, how could they have fallen for it? Look what's happening right now.
Do you want to cancel them?
No, I don't think that the way to fight cancel culture is by canceling people who have canceled other people.
But do you want to deplatform some of this stuff?
No.
Really?
No.
Not even NPR?
No, I want to further delegitimize NPR. Okay. I don't want to deplatform.
What's the difference between deplatforming and delegitimizing?
Deplatforming means taking away their ability to speak.
Okay.
I don't think anybody should have their ability to speak taken away, because I believe that reason, rationality, et cetera, will bend the moral arc towards justice.
And then, so how would you, let's talk about NPR. Why do you want to delegitimize NPR?
Well, NPR has already delegitimized themselves. I just want to push them further down the stairway.
Okay. What? Like, give me an example. How they.
Well, for better or worse, I have this set up in my kitchen, where I can connect my phone to Bluetooth, and so I usually listen to podcasts or sometimes music, but mostly podcasts. Rarely a book on tape. Anyway, the system broke, and I'm not a technological. I couldn't fix it, so I put on the radio, and I just was utterly amazed. And every time I put on NPR, I'm completely taken aback by to the degree to which it's been ideologically captured. So every story, race, gender, sexual orientation. But it's not just that it's about, that's one thing, but it's that there is a very specific narrative. So I heard a story a while ago, I don't remember how many days ago, but it was fairly recently, I had a bunch of people, I think like 5 different people, talking about the Leah Thomas swimming thing, right? And so I think they had her father was one of the people on there, and I think, other people. Everybody was supportive, but there was no like Kathleen Stock. Like there was no like, okay, well, let's take a look at another point of view. Like it was a very specific agenda that they had, and so the consequence of that is that. That answers your question. I've been talking way too much this interview.
No, that reminds me. So I mentioned earlier that I went through a conversion about 8 years ago.
Right.
And I remember, I would say now I'm just a political nomad, first of all. Yeah. So, but I think before that conversion, I was just very much like progressive down the line. Like that was just my perspective. And now I'm more, I don't know. I just make everyone unhappy now. I always have either conservatives are mad at me or the progressives are mad at me, depending on the week. But I remember when I was just beginning to kind of go through that intellectual shift, listening to NPR a couple of times. And I think this was around the time Trump won the first time, so 2016. But I remember one story where the host and then the person being interviewed were talking about some bill that was related to abortion. And it was an abortion bill that was trying to protect unborn life. And so the conversation with the only person who was interviewed was not actually someone who was a proponent of the bill or someone who had anything to do with the bill. It was just, some random academic who would be against it. And then the conversation was just basically like, how crazy are these people? Like that was the extent of the conversation. Right. Like it wasn't as if that perspective was offered and then there was. Right.
So you're correct. So that's exactly. So it's not a news outlet. It's a propaganda mill that's publicly funded. And the other thing is it's very easy to fix this. This is not like, it was, again, to bring it back to Portland State, they prohibited Bruce Gilley's class. He's become a friend of mine. He's a Christian. He's been a very close friend of mine. They prohibited his class. See, atheists can have all kinds of friends. Christians can have all kinds of friends. I know.
I love it.
That's nice. Isn't that nice?
It is.
They wouldn't let him do his political course in political conservatism, which is standard. Even Berkeley has a course in it because they said that it didn't have enough diversity. And I was at a faculty meeting once, and one of my colleagues was bemoaning the fact that, every time I hear a story about PSU, it's always biased this right-wing outlet claiming that we're, this left-wing. I'm like, this is so easy to fix. Mm-hmm. Give Gilley his conservative class. They have nothing to yell about. Like, these things are not, and then you say, we have this guy, he wrote in this conservative thing, or he wrote, this guy published in Wall Street Journal or whatever, and nothing. This is not a complicated problem. You have one person or one panel, like opposing view, and you say, well, should Leah? But they don't even do that because they believe that is a form of injustice.
Right.
So the trick then is to not defund NPR, but is to work in such a way to drive a wedge between liberals and progressives. Tucker Carlson has dramatically increased his viewership now among traditional Democrats. I just listening to a podcast with Michael Shermer, I cannot pronounce her name, but the woman who's an editor at Newsweek, and she was giving some rather remarkable. I read her book; it's wonderful. She was giving some statistics about the percentage of people who are going to who were listening to Tucker Carlson, who were listening to NPR, who were subscribed. There was a boost in the New York Times immediately after Trump, and then it's fallen off. So all these things are what the philosopher Jürgen Habermas calls the legitimation crisis, or legitimacy crisis. There's a crisis of confidence and trust in our institutions. And Elon Musk just tweeted out something about the percentage of, it was a nice little graph. You can add this to the YouTube video. It's really interesting. Percentage of Democrats and Republicans who trust various media institutions. The top one among both, with a narrow band, was the Weather Channel. After that, it was just these huge. But the key then is to drive a wedge between liberals and progressives, and to further work to help people understand that NPR is a propaganda machine, and to stop giving them money.
So when you say drive a wedge between liberals and progressives, can you define how you're using those terms?
Yeah. So this is the semantic range of these terms has increased rather dramatically, and it's complicated. There's classical liberals, and Australia has the Liberal Party, which is actually the Conservative. I mean, it's a very complicated.
Right.
So I would define progressive as a synonym for people who buy into critical social justice, or woke people. And liberals are people kind of like myself. I mostly self-identify as a liberal or a classical liberal. Traditional, concerned about economic divisions. So there's the social and then the economic. So I am concerned about income disparities. I'm concerned about helping the people in the lowest rung of society economically. I also view myself as a social liberal. I don't really care what people do in any kind of bed or whatever. I'm completely fine with homosexuality, gay adoption of children. I don't mind any of that. But I don't believe that identity politics should be a driver in anything. It should have no place in American political life, or any political life anywhere. But NPR has abandoned the liberal cause and are very explicitly advocating for the tenets of critical social justice and identity politics.
One thing I've noticed that I think, I don't know if ironic is the right word, but maybe it's telling, that increasingly, like when I hear social justice conversations, there are exceptions to this, but on the whole, they don't seem to be focused on class. They seem 100%. To be really focused on,
that's right.
Especially race definitely, but also like sexuality and gender. And I wonder, this is not necessarily true about the race piece, but I wonder if the kind of cultural preoccupation with sexuality and gender is a way for elites who are very class privileged to get a sense of moral kind of purity without having to sacrifice anything, right?
Yeah,
because
Henderson calls that a luxury belief.
Yeah, because it's, in I don't know, like planting that sign in your yard, then you kind of get this sense of righteousness and moral superiority.
Virtue signal.
Yeah, but then you don't actually have to sacrifice anything. Like you don't actually have to,
Correct.
Yeah. So
I think you can think about it in terms economically. I think you can think about it in terms of liberals, economic liberals in particular, and the more you go to a left, like if you look at it linearly, socialist, communist, the more they want to flatten the economic hierarchy. But progressives want to flatten the privilege hierarchy.
And those are related though, right? I mean.
No, well, in the progressive mind, class is subordinate to
I see what you're saying.
Other identity characteristics.
I think that's true. I mean, I think that's obviously true because, so here's an example. I have a friend who was on some kind of like reading group text or something, and this was a group text of all people who are at an elite educational institution. And the kind of reading group started by everyone, this interesting little ritual where like, now everyone give an account of like your social location, right? And so he was telling this to me and I was like, oh, well, did any of them say as part of their social location that I'm at an elite institution in one of the richest countries in the world? And he was like, nope. I was like, yeah, I bet they didn't, right? Because so this discourse tends to be centered in places where people are very economically and class privileged.
100%.
And that's not the conversation that happens, right? It becomes this, I don't know. Anyway, so
that's really important. No, I think that's really important. It's always interesting to me, like, why are people talking about this now? Like, I mean, there could be an evolutionary reason we're mixing more, and this is some things so we don't get along and kill each other. I don't know. I'm just bracketing that for a second. Like, but why aren't we talking about anthropogenic warming, the Earth's warming? Mm-hmm. Why aren't we talking about this maniac who's mass murdering people in Ukraine? Like, why is it that we're the singular focus on this and the near total institutional organizational capture of legacy institutions, venerable institutions that once used to be profoundly respected among all Americans, and the idea that we've somehow, I don't really know what it is, but it is part of the, for lack of a word, it's part of the derangement syndrome that's overtaken us.
Why do you have any kind of spitball theories about why you think this is happening now? Like, what are some of the...
I do. I have some, but I just say a question I used to ask people. So I find this question to be very helpful. This helps me in conversations with people. I'll say, if you had a wand and you could do something, and so and you could do X or Y. One of the things that helps me to do in conversations is it helps me to show where somebody is ideologically and politically and what motivates their thinking. And so I'd say, like, okay, if you had a wand and you could either eliminate anthropogenic global warming or you could solve racism, which would it be? And it is amazing to me the number of people I've asked for that, and I have a friend who's a biologist, and I said, if you had a wand and you could either solve anthropogenic global warming, or he said anthropogenic global warming. It's amazing to me the number of people I've asked that question to, a considerable number of people so far, who either have to think about it or have said racism. That's just astonishing to me.
So do you think racism is not a problem anymore?
No, I think it is a problem, but I think the moral arc is bending towards justice. It's going to be the 92% of Americans accept interracial marriage now. The statistics, you can go through the board. There are no miscegenation laws anymore. I mean, it's just unquestionable that it's bending toward justice, except with the Robin DiAngelos and Ta-Nehisi Coates, et cetera, and the Ibram Kendis who are bending it back. No, this is a problem that we're going to fix, which the problem is already fixing itself. I mean, we have, the progressives are forwarding these insane ideas of race essentialism, et cetera, which is interesting because that used to be a conservative idea not too long ago, or extreme right idea. I think that problem will solve itself. I'm not a climate expert by any stretch of the imagination, but if even moderate models are, and the work of Bjorn Lomborg has talked about this, and Michael Schellenberger is a good friend of mine in Apocalypse Now, talked about this. I don't think that this is species threatening, but I do think that if you're faced with adaptation or mitigation, I think it probably, again, I'm not an expert in this, probably we shouldn't be thinking about mitigating, but adapting. And so given that, I think that, and the problems, micro-resistant bacteria, bacteria, plastics in the oceans, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. I mean, we have some pretty serious problems right now, and we don't necessarily need consensus, but the one thing we need is to have honest conversations about things, and we're not only are we not talking about them, the places where we used to talk about them in the academy have failed us. That's why I think you see the meteoric popularity of Joe Rogan, who's more popular by far in downloaded episodes than CNN. I mean, my episode with him, my second episode I did with him, it's like, I don't even know how many, 2-3 million, I don't even know. And that's on YouTube, exponentially, orders of magnitude more than the networks. But people are going to those venues because they're not having the kinds of conversations where they can ask honest questions without being shamed. Professors aren't facilitating that because they don't want a theft of their time with the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. So this is a cascading problem that I see absolutely no fix for in the immediate future.
So you think it's just going to kind of snowball even more?
I think that is an ideology without an expiration date, an ideology with an expiration date, and the reason for that is because they have no 1 Peter 3:15. They have no built-in apologetic, and they can't have one because if you want to sustain an ideology, you either have to have some apologia, some defense of it, in which you train people how to defend it, or you, which they don't. We've talked about no platforming and platform. They won't even have conversations with you. I reached out to countless people to talk about the president of PSU statement of should racial justice be the highest. Nobody. The right wing had a frenzy about it. I was on Tucker Carlson. All these, nobody wanted to talk to me. No. OPB, like literally none of these. I think it's a very reasonable question. But beyond that, and not that anybody is, who am I that invite on nobody, but the idea is that they won't even have a conversation about it. And to perpetuate an ideology, you have to have some ability or willingness to defend it. In your own field, why has Judith Butler's or Martha Nussbaum's criticism of Judith Butler, why do I know a priori that that's never been taught? I can guarantee every time I meet a women's studies major, I've been asking them for years, you ever read Martha Nussbaum's criticism of Judith Butler? No, wonder why that is. Mm-hmm. Right? So the idea is, if you don't have that, you have to have some enforcement mechanism to keep the ideology in place. Fear alone won't do it. So, it could be, we have a kind of political correctness, but some kind of blasphemy law, you have to have that enforced. You have to have offices of diversity weaponized against people who question the narrative. So we know that this ideology simply cannot sustain itself. What we don't know is the damage it will do to our institutions before it's eradicated. It will be extirpated. Its final vestiges will be extirpated. I don't know when that will be. I'm going to have a huge party, many drinks.
See, that sounds like, you're using words like extirpation and eradication, and that sounds like you want to cancel them. Like, I don't know, it seems like different.
No, see the word you use them. Okay. I'm talking about the ideology. You switch to people.
Okay, right. But then there's a difference, is there a difference between, say, allowing this ideology to have an expression alongside other views, or does it have to be completely eradicated?
So here's my question to you. Should we allow an ideology that wants to throw people in ovens on the basis of some immutable characteristic?
Well, no. That sounds like
there's your answer.
Yeah, but who's arguing that we should throw people in ovens?
Well, a good part of the last century was overtaken by that.
No, like right now. Like even the worst of...
I know.
Okay.
But the idea is, it's not that who's arguing it. The idea is that are there limits to what we should allow?
Right, sure.
Limits to what a society, an open society, should allow. And again, I don't think that the solution is canceling anything. I think the solution is beating it by discourse, by debate. Mm-hmm. I'm not a big fan of debate myself. I prefer conversation. But the idea is giving reasons against the position, even if it's Holocaust denial. David Irving going off in his Holocaust denial thing. And Christopher Hitchens spoke very elegantly about why that should not be banned in Austria and Germany. But I and my friend Michael Shermer has spoken about that as well. But I think we have a very pernicious ideology. Mm-hmm. It's explicitly dedicated to the destruction of Western civilization. Mm-hmm. It wants to. So the question is, what do we do about it? The other thing is, we know where it's coming from. It's not like it's a mystery. We not only do we know where it's coming from, the people in the academies are screaming about it from the rooftops, what they want to do. It's the least secret thing that could possibly be.
So it's coming from the academy, is that what you're saying?
Well, we know, that's the nucleation point of the whole thing. Mm-hmm. And again, it's not like it's a secret.
Right. Yeah. So I guess a better way to frame my question is, I guess in making the analogy between this critical social justice ideology that you've been talking about and Nazism.
Okay, hold on. I got to pause. I just use that as an example. We can use another thing to your question about what should be to your question about what should be done about that. My point I want to make is are there some ideologies that should be eradicated? Mm-hmm. And it seems clear to me, if what you mean by eradication is through legal means, the answer is no. But if what you mean is by full epistemological and bringing the tanks of reason, bringing the whole arsenal up to defeat this. And the best example I can think of is Holocaust denial. So again, to mention, I don't know why he's come up so many times, maybe because I just listened to his podcast, but David Irving and others were denying that, I think it was Treblinka, were denying that there was a Holocaust. They said, well, it's not true, and they gave a bunch of things like, why didn't the doors have locks on them? So Schirmer flew down there and looked and investigated, and he published the results of investigation. So now we know that. So now if somebody else makes those arguments, we have a way to rebut that we didn't need to make it illegal. We didn't need to make it.
I see. Okay. So you're saying like eradicate it by like bringing good arguments against it.
By bringing the force of reason so nobody could possibly believe it because it's simply untrue.
Rather than say just having like through an exertion of power.
Yeah, so that won't work because what will happen, it was just suppress the idea and people are going to believe it anyway. Yeah. So that's why we have to have dialogue and conversation.
Have you found people who will dialogue with you from that perspective?
No.
Really?
No. Lori Penny is the only one, nobody else.
Like public, will she do it publicly?
I don't know. We did an exchange. David Packman is the only person on the left who'll have me on. Huh. I think he's had me on 3 times or so, but nobody on the left. I've reached out to them, even after, media outlets like Slate or Salon do hit pieces on me. I used to call them. I used to literally call them on the phone. Like, I'd like to publish a rebuttal. I'd like to make a response to that. I'd email, call it nothing. So at this point, I don't think I even want to do that anymore. I've given up. There's just a point where you just say, okay, you know what? I sincerely tried. I'm not going to play this game anymore. I'm just going to do my own thing. So that's what I do. I do my own thing. I give talk. I'm giving a talk here today. I write. I publish pieces about it. I put out video series. There just has to come a time where you have to say so the other thing. So one more thing. I don't feel that the people with whom I'm attempting to engage are honest brokers of conversation.
Why?
Well, I feel, as I mentioned, I have substantive political disagreements with many people on the right. These are the nicest people. I've been to their homes. I've been on their shows, and we really drill down and we have at it. And I would hope they find those engaging. I like them. I've learned a lot. It's caused me to modify some of my beliefs. I certainly hope it has them, but I don't know. The reason is because if they truly believed, like if you really believe that you know something that's true, why wouldn't you want to engage somebody on it?
That's a great question. Yeah. What do you think is the
answer? Well, they don't believe it's true.
Really?
Yeah. Or they don't believe that language is the vehicle to express that truth. They believe that their personal feelings, their kind of testimonies, their life experience, their lived experience is inherently unfalsifiable, and it trumps anything that one could say linguistically, any verbiage one can use. But that's interesting because that also comports with their larger worldview. Their larger worldview is that they have some privileged access to the truth. But if you want, but nobody lives like that. I mean, you're married. There must be some days where you're like, oh, my husband, I can't stand him, right? So I'm going to get right. So you're laughing, so we know it's true. I mean, that's just a relationship. Like people go through, and it's not that it's emotionally capricious, but we go through ups and downs, et cetera. And one of the things, it's like, I think it's in the Philebus where Socrates says, reason must be the lead horse of the chariot with the desire and emotion behind. So you have to lead the horse by chariot. And so what we have is we have an almost complete inversion of that, where desire is where reason is subordinate to those things, if it plays a role at all in those things. And I think when you look around the society, you see the manifestations of that. I mean, the empire is done. We have people who don't value basic things that people have fought and died for and that we've figured out, and that we have a history of contemporary jurisprudence that shows that that we know why we read people their Miranda rights. We know why we do this. We know why we have basic property rights, right? I mean, we've we've worked out freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and yet we have our academies, by and large, have turned against the fundamental values of this country. And it's the end of empire. And if you think that the U.S. was bad, wait until you see the new hegemon. Wait until the Chinese come over with their Belt and Road initiatives. They're already they bought up 75% of the critical infrastructure in Australia, the Northern Territories. Right? Their ports, the Chinese can literally turn off telecommunications. We see the Belt and Road policy all throughout Africa. Anyway, so all the people who have been down on the United States, if you really want to wish someone harm, wish that their children and their children's children live under which to come.
Oh, that's really apocalyptic. All right, is that your prediction of what's going to happen, or is it? Because then earlier in the conversation, you were like, "I can't wait for this ideology to be eradicated." So
right.
It seems like part of you is like, and even your arc of the universe.
Right. Well, that's the thing. That's the question.
That sounds very optimistic to me, by the way.
With the moral arc bending towards justice. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that's Martin Luther King's idea, and others have articulated it far better than I.
I know, but I don't know. I mean, I guess it's what I see evidence for, but then I also see evidence against it. And even in what you just said, it kind of sounds much more like.
Well, that's the thing. What is the promise of America, right? What is the promise of the country? The promise of the country, what is the shining city on a hill? It's that we can all come and we can live and we can breathe free, right? It's the inscription in the Statue of Liberty.
Right.
It's that you can have your Catholicism or lose it or have other faith. I can have whatever my thing is doing. Someone can be doing their thing. Another person can be doing their thing. And what happens when we don't value that? What happens when we don't come together, but instead of, to borrow a term from physics, a supraordinate identity where we see commonalities. Oh, you speak English, you're American, or you like jujitsu, whatever it is. But we drill down into ever finer points of immutable characteristics, like identity markers, things that have identity level salience. I mean, I'm telling you, this is not, I don't know. I don't want to be overly negative, but I've just been super down on the way things are going, and I just don't see it turning anytime soon.
Yeah, I have days where I'm more optimistic, days when I'm less optimistic. Yeah. So here's a little confession. Last year, we got a dog for the first time, and he's an Anatolian Shepherd. He's really big. He loves other dogs, so I take him to the dog park as much as I can. And I would say like half the times I take him to the dog park, I think of you. And I think of your work.
It's one of the nicest things anyone's ever said to me.
It's true, though. It's true. So yeah, the whole grievance studies scandal, shall we call it a scandal? I don't know. So can you just give a little brief overview of what that was and the outcome of that?
Oh boy, I don't think about that stuff anymore.
You don't? Why not? Just because it was so long ago?
Yeah, it's just the grievance studies is following the work on Alan Sokol. We published a bunch of papers in reputable feminist journals, or what we call grievance studies, journals that push an ideological view, a grievance about the world, some usually gender, race, sexuality, to show that there were entire bodies of literature that were corrupted. We got busted by the Wall Street Journal, I think, when we had 7 papers in.
So you wanted to keep going?
Oh, we would have for sure gotten 12 or 13 for sure, because we got much better writing.
How did they find out about it?
Oh God, I haven't thought about this. It's painful for me to talk about.
I'm sorry.
We needed to fabricate someone, and I was so stupid. I gave her a PhD in feminist studies, and I should have given her a PhD in
women's studies,
something
studies.
Like that. When there are more programs. But yeah, the Wall Street Journal caught us, which is anyway. It is what it is. And my school went on the rampage. By the way, I think this is a funny story. So we plagiarized Hitler's Mein Kampf twice. In one of the papers, we just took out a Jew and put in white man, and the other one we did a rewriting. I think it was, I can't remember, the chapter 12 or so. And they brought me up on formal charges of plagiarism, and I pled guilty. I said I did.
Yeah. So they is PSU. Or
I said, I plead guilty. I plagiarized Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, and they wouldn't prosecute me. They wouldn't let the charges, their own charges. Because if they did, so that was itself, the kangaroo court was itself ideological. Because if I did, that would mean that the journals accepted Mein Kampf.
Right.
So they couldn't have that.
Right.
Right. So the whole thing was a farce.
Yeah. Yeah. So the one, I mean, my dog park reference, just for listeners in case they're not familiar with that, which is one of the fictional studies, one of the articles that you published in a peer-reviewed academic journal. So I mean, that's what you're saying here was a study about rape culture in Portland area dog parks.
Right, and queer performativity. And the woman we claimed, I can't remember, like she closely inspected the genitals of 10,000 dogs and then interrogated their owners as to their sexual preference or something. And I mean, it was just such an insane paper. And
so insane.
I mean, it was truly, these canine petri dishes for canine rape culture. And so it was a peak insane paper. And the paper won an award. They liked it so much.
That's so amazing.
Pride of place. Yeah. Won an award.
Yes. Well, now it's stuck in my head. Every time I'm in a dog park, I think about that.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Mm-hmm. And that also goes to show the difficulty in changing the institutions is because they've created these bodies of literature which are just bogus. They're just they're the musings of ideologues, and they're passing these things off as knowledge. And so how do you overcome that scholastic inertia to, and the other people have jobs for life. So, and then, it's funny, it's like every once in a while I'll see a criticism, those weren't real journals. Great, wonderful. We publish in the top feminist journals in the world. Great. Hypatia, not a real journal. I'll take it. Delegitimize the whole thing. That's it.
So
I'm delighted by that.
You got a paper accepted in Hypatia.
Yeah, I think we may. Oh, they wanted the other one. I can't. Yeah, we got one, and we had one more. They wanted revisions on it, if memory serves me correctly.
Wow. I mean, that is like the premier feminist philosophy journal.
Right. And then the one we got accepted, you want me to tell you this one? So I don't talk about this because it's too conceptually difficult and almost nobody would understand it, but you're Dean, very smart woman and feminist scholar. So the paper was titled, I can't remember the exact title, but something like, I think it had a colon in it, but When the Joke's on You. Mm-hmm. And in this paper, we talked about myself, Peter Boghossian, and James Lindsay, and we had previously published a paper called The Conceptual Penis as a Social Construct. And in that paper, we argued that, penises were, because these people believe everything is a construct, right? Well, the penis is a construct. And
sure. That's Lacan, phallogocentrism.
Everything is a construct. The penis is a construct. Penis is responsible for global climate change. And we put in all these vulgarities, like really great vulgarities too, not like chump vulgar, like wonderful, delicious vulgarities. Probably shouldn't have said the word delicious. But anyway, and so we argued in this paper, When the Joke's on You, we were arguing that the joke was on Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay because humor can only be used one way, when it's the underdog criticizing the powerful. Mm-hmm. But the point of the paper was that the joke was on them publishing a paper saying the joke was on us.
Whoa.
That's meta.
That is very meta.
Yeah. So we wrote this paper. It's actually even more meta than that when you drill down on it. But I can't explain that to people because it's just too complicated. So it's like, but the dog park is easy, right? Everybody dog rapes and
I love that it's in Portland too.
Dogs.
Like that makes it even more perfect for some reason. Like just,
Right. Wow. Three parks in Portland, Oregon. Yeah. Thousands of hours. The whole thing is insane, but that's it. But you would think that, so, after we did the conceptual penis, people are like, it didn't prove it. You need to do this. And I'm like, all right, well, we do that. And do you think any of the people when we did that said, well, geez, maybe there's a problem here. Maybe these fields, maybe it's a little too ideological. No, there was none of that. There was like, it's not Hypatia is not a real joke. Whatever it was, you're a Nazi or you're some kind of conservative. How about this? Is it possible that there is a corruption in the scholastic literature? And so then, we got a lot of this. yeah, but psychology, it has a problem too.
Right.
The replication crisis.
Yes,
or,
that's
yeah,
true.
but some journal, some discipline over. Helen Pluckrose has a brilliant answer for that. Her answer for that is, if my house has a cockroach infestation and I try to take the cockroaches out of my house, the response to that is, yeah, well, what about your neighbor's house? They have an infestation of rats. What are you doing about their house? Well, actually nothing, because I don't live in that house. Mm-hmm. I live in my own house and we have a cockroach infestation. Mm-hmm. So instead of saying, oh, geez, something's wrong, they ask why we didn't do anything about something else. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's just it really goes to show you that people, they think that the reason people hold a belief with such tenacity is almost never on epistemological grounds. It's almost always because they believe holding the belief will make them a better person.
Oh, I think that's very true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is conspicuous in the realm of religion. It's conspicuous in the academy, and it's conspicuous with ideas that have a moral valence.
I think that's true. And I think that's a better interpretation than but that seems like a different interpretation than what you were saying earlier, that people don't really believe this.
Right. Or for example, they will publish something that they don't actually believe, but they know that it will increase the likelihood that they'll get published if they hit certain notes, and thus they'll get tenure.
Yeah,
or
I think that's true.
They'll go in the promotion and tenure basket.
Yeah. I mean, I think I played that game a little bit, right? So I have a master's degree in women's and gender studies, women's writing and gender studies. And then I did a PhD in English, but very much feminist literary criticism. I even have a feminist and women's studies book award. Oh, wow. So bona fide over here.
Good for you.
But and I wasn't like this cynical person that was like, I don't believe any of this. I just think it was just the waters I was swimming in, I mean,
Totally.
I was never invited to really kind of step back and question some of the worldview premises. It was just like, you're thrown in the deep end, you're reading Butler, you're reading Derrida, you're reading Lacan, and it's just, you absorb this worldview where everything is socially and linguistically constructed. And there would be these moments of clarity where I would suddenly kind of lift my head up and be like, is everything I'm doing just a language game? Like in my dissertation, where I'm just sort of like taking a theory and here's a text and I'm reading the text through the theory and here's what I see. But I just kind of felt like this game, like it wasn't tethered to anything real.
Okay. I think this is really important. So I do a lot of martial arts. Well, I do one martial art now at my age, but I do jiu-jitsu. And it's very interesting. My coach, I mentioned before, is a very, very good friend of mine. We play Dungeons and Dragons together and we hang out together. It's my
husband likes Dungeons and Dragons.
Good.
See, I think you would have a crush on my husband if you met him.
It's one of my hobbies. Science fiction TV is my other hobby. But he was telling me, and I've seen this in my experience, that this is totally true. One of the things that happens when people participate in a martial art, a fantasy-based martial art, in other words, they're doing all this stuff, is that at some point in their training, I think, I'm going to say this, I'm going to get no one's going to comment on this. I won't get many hate mails from this, but I'm going to say this, I'll bet you I'm going to get 50 hate mails from this one comment I'm about to make. People will train in a fantasy-based martial art like Krav Maga or like, I don't know, Taekwondo is mostly fantasy, but not exclusively, Tai Chi or what have you. And they will realize at some point in their training, their blood, their sweat, and their tears, that this is BS. They will realize that what they've been working for will not help with the goal of winning a fight. And the consequence of that will not be, if they have any honor and integrity, to try a martial art that we know works. There are only 5 or 6 martial arts we know works. Western boxing, kickboxing, Muay Thai, Savate, jiu-jitsu, wrestling, judo in certain contexts. Okay. So consequently, you need more rituals, the bowing, the using. You need more kind of formalism. But young men in particular are very susceptible to that. And over time, if you're in that long enough, the moment that you realize it doesn't work, you become a dick. You treat people unjustly and cruelly. You pick on them. You have to do something to make up the slack for the fact that you don't work. You see the same thing in intellectual and scholastic disciplines in which those disciplines are not, when those disciplines are not tethered to reality. There's a kind of intellectual dissonance on the part of the practitioner that causes them to manifest that in some way that's almost always nasty and negative. They discharge that, they push that out as opposed to being honest with themselves. So we also have a crisis of honesty now. Right? We have a crisis of sincerity.
Yeah. I think part of it too is just kind of groupthink, right? So if you're not, if you're not invited to, I guess there's
It's absolutely
yeah.
correct.
I mean, I can think about, my days as a very progressive feminist who didn't really, although I was still even a little bit of a heretical feminist. I've always been a little bit heretical. I've always kind of been comfortable with the idea of some kind of essentialism, which I know is, but I would try to like hide it because I knew that wasn't popular,
So the group, okay. So the group thing is really important. I published a piece in the Philosophers magazine about this. So, so one of the things that I think it's conspicuous that's happening now is that, just mention him a fourth time, I don't know. Shermer writes in The Believing Brain, one of the reasons that smart people believe weird things is that smart people are better at coming up with good reasons for bad conclusions. I think that's the single greatest insight in all of critical thinking. That's an astonishing insight. So I took that and I magnified that in this piece for the Philosophers magazine and said that what I think is happening now is that groups of really smart people, philosophers in particular, they're really good at analytic reasoning, they're good at inferences, they're good at et cetera, and they're coming up with reasons to justify the dominant moral orthodoxy, which is social justice. And it's not because it's true. It's not because it's true. And so they become mouthpieces for the orthodoxy. So I think in large part, I'm not necessarily sure they're ever the gatekeepers of truth and reason, but the gatekeepers have fallen.
Yeah.
And our institutions are falling down rabbit holes of groupthink.
So how do you keep yourself from becoming an ideologue?
A few things. Willingness to revise my beliefs about things. That's one of my lodestars. It's not my North Star. Trustful. This is from the American Philosophical Association's Delphi Report 1990-1991. These are certain attitudinal dispositions that one can have. Finding friends who have different beliefs, enjoying the conversations and being challenged. I just gave a talk at, I was on a panel at Princeton, and I said something and some guy came up from the audience and he said something that challenged my belief, and I thought about it, and he was right, and I said, I changed my mind, you're right.
You don't remember what it was?
Yeah, it was about my threshold for speech, so what I would allow. So I changed my threshold as a result of his comment. But changing your mind in public in real time, I think, is important. I think at core, it's the realization that we all want belonging and community, and the only thing that we want more than to not be wrong is to be welcomed and to feel belonging, to feel love, feel community. And when you have the realization that if you're a person of integrity, Aristotle says the highest form of friendship is between two virtuous people. And he has this little hierarchy of friendship, like your cousin, someone you have common interests with, someone who likes conversation, then people of virtue. When you really understand, when you grok that, your life will change in a profound way in that you will so I live with a woman who, she's truly one of the most remarkable people I've ever met in my life. She's a former heroin addict. She's functionally illiterate. She went on to become a professional bodybuilder. She's one of my best friends. She told me if she ever gets married, I would be her best man. And I was very touched by that. She's gone through some trauma. She's been assaulted sexually, et cetera, et cetera. But she told me something last night when she picked me up from the train station. She said, when you're an addict, you think that these people are your friends. They come to your house, but they'll stay in your bathroom for an hour. I said, what do they do in your bathroom? They're shooting up, or they'll get you for $20 they want. That's a more extreme example. But I think if you're truly sincere and you say what you mean, you will find people who will know you for who you are and love you for who you are. Because what we have now is we have a culture in which people are afraid to say what they mean. And if you're afraid to say what you mean to me, I will never know who you are. Mm-hmm. I will only know who I think you are. And you'll never know who I am because neither one of us are being honest with each other because we're not saying what we mean. And even worse than that, I won't even know what I mean. So I think one of the ways to keep your moorings in this is you just have to say what you mean. The Greeks have the word parrhesia, speaking truth in the face of danger. You have to be honest with people, and you have to be willing, if somebody decides they don't want to be your quote unquote friend, they were really never your friend to begin with.
Yeah. And see, I think what you're describing, I think you're exactly right. But I think what you're describing explains more the motivation for people not being willing to be honest than a more cynical read. I think it really has to do with fear of losing community, fear of rejection of one's community, fear of, you know,
and the thing that
not belonging.
My comment to those people is they're not really your friend. The level of friendship you have, you know, like one of those GRE questions, you know, with my friend who was the former heroin addict, her quote unquote friends, is to what you think you have is literally nothing to what you can imagine to having a friendship of virtue. And I can truly say, to borrow a term from your vernacular, I am blessed to have the sorts of friends that I have who not only say what they mean, who will call me out if they think I've done something wrong, who will, they're just true friends and friendships of virtue. And it's okay to make mistakes around those people. And it's okay to be vulnerable around those people. And it's okay to, you know, say you don't know. If anything, you never, if you find here's like a litmus test. I just thought of this right now. But if you find that you have to pretend something, these are not your friends. You'll be far better off losing your community and finding a new group of people in which you don't have to pretend anything.
Yeah. I totally agree with that. And it's been refreshing to talk to you because I felt that you're completely honest and open, and it's good to have a conversation like that.
I appreciate that. Thank you. It's the same, so thank you.
This has been a production of George Fox Digital. If you like what you're hearing, subscribe to the George Fox Talks podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts on your phone or computer. You can check us out on the web at georgefox.edu/talks, where we have videos, publications, and more. And you can also find our playlist on YouTube at youtube.com/GeorgeFoxTalks.